Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative. Really glad to see folks trickling in from our growing community of practice. My name is Alli Gillespie, and I'm the Network Engagement Coordinator with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, or the RSRI. On behalf of the RSRI, I'm excited to welcome you all to this session of our webinar and learning series, 12 Months, 12 Domains. This series is designed to take a deeper, more intentional look at the Self-Reliance Index, or the SRI, by focusing on one domain at a time. So for those unfamiliar, the Self-Reliance Index is a measurement tool containing 12 domains that focuses on a refugee household's basic needs, resources, and sustainability, with the mind to understand how self-reliant households are and how that self-reliance shifts over time. Domains also measure conditions and assets that increase the likelihood that refugee households will be able to continue meeting their needs in the future. The tool makes really valuable contributions to practitioners' ability to measure the impact that humanitarian services have in the long term on client self-reliance. So if you're interested in learning more about the SRI tool, you can access resources on our website or by contacting the RSRI Training and Technical Support Manager, Ned Meerdink. There are lots of ways we can support you in your application of the SRI, in your programming, or your advocacy, and we're really eager to help. Over the course of this year, our monthly webinars are spotlighting each of the SRI's 12 domains. And the goal here is really to move beyond high-level discussion and really dig into what each domain looks like in practice, what it means for program design, for policy, and for how we understand and support refugee self-reliance across different contexts. So one of the core understandings of the SRI is that responses in all sectors can and should contribute to promoting self-reliance. For example, livelihood programs can use the SRI to understand community level gaps in access to healthcare and use this understanding to create referral networks and partnerships with local clinics. So really, we all have a role to play here. So throughout our 12 months, 12 domains learning series, you can expect focused discussions, practical insights and resources, expert perspectives, and real world case studies from practitioners and members of the RSRI's broader community of practice and network. These conversations are meant to support learning, reflection, and action, using the SRI not just as a measurement tool, but really as a framework for deeper understanding and more responsive programming. So today we're focusing on health status and the role of health status as both a systemic enabler of and barrier to refugee self-reliance across contexts. Domain 5 of the SRI tool asks whether anyone in a participant's household has a physical or psychological health condition that interferes with income-generating activities. While this measure is very important for understanding a household's economic capacity, the relationship between health, disability, and self-reliance extends far beyond employment alone. Achieving self-reliance requires that programs, employers, and other refugee-serving institutions create environments where refugees with diverse physical, sensory, intellectual, and psychosocial disabilities can fully access services, opportunities, and pathways to participation. In today's webinar, we will explore how health status, disability, and well-being shape more inclusive understandings of self-reliance. Drawing on the expertise and lived experience of our panelists, we will discuss practical approaches, promising strategies, and policy considerations for strengthening disability-inclusive programs and systems that support refugee integration and belonging. So we will begin with a presentation from Simar Singh and Dr. Sanasha Braxton from RefugePoint on the mutually enabling relationship between mental health and psychosocial well-being and self-reliance. To introduce these two, Simar Singh is RefugePoint's Chief Program Officer and a technical advisor to the RSRI. She has more than 15 years of experience building partnerships, shaping policy, and developing standards of practice to support people affected by conflict and displacement. Simar has worked across humanitarian contexts in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, and has designed and delivered training for UN agencies and NGOs on child protection, humanitarian access, and negotiation. She holds a graduate degree in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School and an undergraduate degree in international relations from Mount Holyoke College. Simar will be co-presenting with Dr. Sanasha Braxton, a multilingual clinical psychologist, global mental health practitioner, and decolonial scholar activist with more than 20 years of experience across global humanitarian settings. As Senior Technical Advisor for Mental Health and Psychosocial Support at RefugePoint, Dr. Braxton co-designs community-based mental health programs and advances culturally grounded approaches to healing. Her work integrates African-centered, Indigenous, and somatic traditions, and she currently serves as Cultural Equity Editor for the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, as well as the president of the Metro Atlanta chapter of the International Association of Black Psychologists. So welcome, Simmer and Dr. Braxton. And after this presentation on the relationship between mental health and psychosocial well-being and self-reliance, we'll move to our panel discussion where we'll hear from panelists on their insights from their work across different contexts. We have a very exciting panel lined up today. The first panelist I'd like to introduce is Dr. Mustafa Rifat. Mustafa is an incoming assistant professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha's Grace Abbott School of Social Work. He earned his PhD in social work from Washington University in St. Louis, where his research focused on the social determinants of health among refugees and immigrants with disabilities. Drawing on his lived experience as both a refugee and a person with disabilities, Dr. Rifat conducts community-engaged research that advances disability justice, health equity, and inclusion across diverse global contexts. Next, please join me in welcoming Elham Yousefian. Elham is the Director of Disability Inclusion and Accessibility at the International Refugee Assistance Project, or IRAP. Her mission is to advocate for equal access to international protection, human rights, and meaningful participation for refugees and displaced persons with disabilities. As a blind human rights lawyer born and raised in Iran, she advocates for equal access to protection, rights, and meaningful participation for refugees and displaced people with disabilities. Prior to joining IRAP, she served as Senior Advisor on Humanitarian, Disaster Risk Reduction, and Climate Action at the International Disability Alliance. In 2023, Elham was recognized as one of BBC's 100 Influential Women for her leadership in advancing disability-inclusive climate action. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Julius Tobua. Julius is the Office Director of Newcomers with Disabilities in Sweden and Chair of the Global Network of Refugees with Disabilities, or GNRD. He has a background in migration and integration studies through programs at the Swedish Institute at Gothenburg University and the School of Public Administration in Tbilisi, Georgia. Julius also serves on the steering committee of the Task Group on Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction, where he is the European coordinator and it advocates for greater inclusion of refugees with disabilities in policy and practice. We're very grateful to our speakers and panelists for sharing their time and expertise today, and to all of you who are attending this session for being part of the conversation. We encourage you to engage in our Q&A by submitting questions via the Q&A box, to reflect and to think about how the ideas shared today might apply to your own work and contexts. Some final housekeeping notes. Again, please add any questions that you have during the session to the Q&A box. We do have captions available in multiple languages. To access them, turn to the Zoom menu on your screen, select captions, and then select your speaking language. With that, I am pleased to kick off our 12 months, 12 domains webinar on health status and disability inclusion today. So I will now turn it over to Simmer and Dr. Braxton from RefugePoint for their featured presentation. Over to you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Alli, for the introduction. I am just really honored to be with you all today. Again, my name is Dr. Sanasha Braxton. It's listening to the wealth of wisdom and experience that exists on this panel. Again, it's just really incredible to be amongst such incredible panelists. So, getting started, Simmer and I will be sharing a little bit today about mental health and self-reliance and integrated programming approach. And I wanted to start by sharing what might be obvious, but why this is such an important moment for us to be talking about self-reliance and mental health together today. And I would say that, as we all know, the moment very much has demanded it. We are in a space and a period in time where humanitarian funding is shrinking. The political climate towards refugees has become even more hostile, and the anxiety about the unknown has really become a defining feature of refugee life. And so, as this humanitarian space contracts and the people that we serve are being asked to do more with less, the conversation opens up what an integrated self-reliance and mental health approach can look like in a season like this one. Next slide, please, Ali. So, I would like to start by grounding us in a shared understanding of two definitions, and those are the definitions of mental health and psychosocial supports, rather, three definitions, and self-reliance. So, please, next slide. So for RefugePoint, we don't hold an official definition of mental health, but one commonly referenced which comes to mind is that of the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, to realize their abilities, learn and work well, and contribute to their community, and that it is a basic human right. And to honor the social definitions that also, or the social dimensions rather, we also use the term mental health and psychosocial support, or MHPSS, which might be familiar to some folks. And that holds the fabric surrounding a person. So that's family, that's community, culture, spiritual life. It can also be access to basic needs. And the definition of self-reliance is one that we share with UNHCR. And it is that self-reliance is the social and economic ability of an individual, a household, or a community to meet essential needs in a sustainable manner and with dignity. Next slide, please. So I would like to begin with a short narrative from one of our clients, Ahmed, who told us that self-reliance means being happy and having freedom. If your mind is healthy and not stressed, you can grow from small to big. Nothing makes me happier than providing for myself independently. And I start here because Ahmed names what our programming has really come to understand at its core, and that's that self-reliance is not purely economic, it's also psychological, it's also social, and the healthy mind, free of stress, is what allows a person to grow, to provide, and to feel whole. And that's exactly why MHPSS sits very close to our self-reliance work. In our direct service work within our urban refugee protection program in Nairobi, individual and group counseling sit alongside food, housing, and medical support. And because for a family, it can be very difficult to find solid economic footing while their inner world is still in crisis, it becomes very important to be able to have access to mental health support during this time. And so healing really does require being tended to in the same breath as survival. And even after a client gains stability, counseling does remain an option because being free of crisis is not the same as being whole. And any of us who have been in therapy know that. So this support then can move into other spaces. It can also be found outside of the counseling room. It can show up inside of livelihood trainings where our direct service staff provide support in business mentorship, which might shape, for example, how a person communicates with a customer or absorbs a setback or a shock. In our community-based work, we start from the central truth that many community and communal cultures already hold, and that's that a person is not a separate unit to be fixed, and that a person is not a person without other people. So this idea of Ubuntu. And so there is a thread that is really woven between this living web of relationships, and the whole system is grounded in local knowledge. And this means three things for our community-based mental health and psychosocial support work. It strengthens what is already breathing. So, firstly, every community holds its own helping roles and healing practices that they've leaned on for generations. And our work is to honor those and not replace them. So, an example of this is our arts-based mental health campaigns. And those open space for expression, they help people to name, to remember, and experience the healing practices their traditions already hold, ones that are rooted in joy and in movement and in gathering resources that they have already had in their hands. And then secondly, we weave new support into the structures that the community already trusts and uses. So whether that's women's cooperatives or caregiving groups, when support lives inside what people already use or rely on, it doesn't need outsiders to hold it up. It belongs to the community itself. So an example of this is our participatory community-based needs and asset mapping exercise, which shows this in practice. So communities have and individuals have namespaces where they're already experiencing healing. And from there, our work is to support and capacity bridge within those structures or to help others recognize that those healing spaces have been present all along. And then thirdly, we share the task of care across communities. So we work with training other community members in psychological first aid, traditional healers, teachers, neighbors who are learned and respected. And that is the reason for that is that we recognize that healing has always lived in community hands and that there's oftentimes simply not enough specialists to be able to work with the large number of folks who might be needing support. So those are a few examples, which I believe bring us back to where I opened, which is that mental health and self-reliance are very much interconnected. And again, as Ahmed mentioned, a healthy mind is what lets a person grow from small to big. And so that is why our direct service tends to the inner world in the same breath as the meal or as the medical care. And it's why our community work returns healing to the hands that have always carried it. The definition of self-reliance, as you heard in the beginning, it names three homes for this ability, and we honor each of those. So at the level of the individual, very broadly, we can think that a person who is well is able to provide for their families. At the level of the household, a family that eats well can rest well. And at the level of community, people who know that their own resources exist and are capable are no longer waiting to be rescued. And so this is some of what intentional integration of mental health and self-reliance have looked like at RefugePoint, and we continue to learn more and do more and engage in different work. But we do not carry healing space for refugees from the outside. We honor the healing that already lives inside of the individual, the household, the community, and we make room for it to grow. And that is really self-reliance in full. It's sustainable because the capacity lives within. It is dignified because people define it for themselves. And this is the work that we continue to learn about and engage in here at Refuge Point. And so with that, I will pass it over to my colleague Simmer Singh, who will share a little bit more.
You. Next slide, please. Right. So as Sanasha just shared, through Refuge Point's MHPSS and Self-Reliance programming over the years, we have directly observed how mental health and self-reliance reinforce one another. We've seen this relationship through insights from program monitoring and evaluation data, including through feedback from our clients, just with the quote that Sanasha put up from our client Ahmed that sort of encapsulates this perfectly. At Refuge Point, we were eager to find out if our observations were backed by broader evidence and experience. And so we've partnered with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative and UNHCR to examine existing research on mental health and self-reliance in displacement contexts. Our findings are being written up in a brief, but we wanted to share some emerging insights from our work so far. And we can go to the next slide, please. You can click again. Thank you. So I'm going to share three of our emerging insights from this forthcoming brief with you. And this is, again, just reflecting what's come out of a review of the existing evidence base. So first, one of the clearest findings emerging from our work so far is that good mental health both enables and results from self-reliance. Mental health and psychosocial support strengthen the cognitive, emotional, and social capacities that people need to pursue livelihoods, to navigate services, to build relationships, and to make decisions about their futures, all of which are key elements for becoming self-reliant. And at the same time, when refugees are self-reliant, that is, they're able to meet their needs, to be active in their communities, and exercise greater agency over their circumstances, we often see improvements in well-being, dignity, hope, and overall mental health. So this is a two-way mutually reinforcing relationship. The second insight is that, particularly given the current moment where there is sort of an immense scale of need amongst forcibly displaced persons, And this is paired with dramatically reduced funding in the humanitarian sector. All of this means that a question many of us are asking ourselves is, how can we invest in smarter and more effective approaches that simultaneously improve well-being and also reduce dependency, long-term dependency on aid? And so the second insight from our work is that the evidence suggests that integrating mental health and self-reliance programming is an effective pathway to do so. Sanasha started to give some examples of how this works at RefugePoint, but more broadly, integrated programming can take a number of different forms. For example, it could mean that self-reliance programs are designed with mental health considerations in mind, or it may involve more fully integrated models where mental health and self-reliance interventions are co-designed from the outset. There are a number of different models and approaches out there in the evidence space. And this, recognizing that there's a spectrum, there's no one size that fits all, is important because different approaches work well for different settings and different populations. And each approach requires different levels of investment, capacity, and partnership. However, across contexts, the evidence suggests that addressing mental health and self-reliance together can produce stronger and more sustainable outcomes than addressing either in isolation. So this is a very helpful and practical insight for members of our community who are working on programming. And then the final piece that point that I want to highlight is that while the conceptual link between mental health and self-reliance is clear from the evidence, we do need more information and more evidence on how to leverage this relationship in practice. So there are still gaps in the evidence base. We need more information, more evidence on what works best for whom and in which contexts. What we're finding is that there is still need to invest in rigorous evaluations of integrated approaches, particularly of integrating MHPSS within livelihoods and economic inclusion programming. We also need to better understand the role of community-based supports, local healing traditions, and the lived experience of displaced populations. Again, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence around this, but the evidence base is a bit thin on the more rigorous evaluations, looking at the contribution of these components towards increased self-reliance and increased mental health. And finally, we also need more evidence on how gains in self-reliance affect well-being across entire households. We found and we know that there are tools and efforts to fill this evidence gap. Tools such as the Self-Reliance Index, which Alli sort of introduced at the outset of this webinar, are helping us measure the connections between mental health and self-reliance more holistically, especially when that tool is being used alongside established mental health measures. So there are efforts underway to fill these gaps, but there's much more that we would like to see from across the sector. In the interest of time, I'll stop here. But as I mentioned at the outset, this policy brief is still being finalized. It is a joint effort between RefugePoint, the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, and UNHCR. When it comes out, it will include more information on these emerging insights that I've shared, along with links to resources from the evidence base, as well as practical guidance for researchers, implementers, policymakers, and donors that are all seeking to strengthen mental health and self-reliance outcome for displaced persons. So please stay tuned for more information about the launch of the brief. We will host a webinar where we will present and discuss the findings, and we welcome your engagement. Alli, you can go to the next slide where we have contact information in case anyone wants to hear more in the meantime. And finally, if you do have questions for me or for my colleague Sanasha, you are welcome to add them to the Q&A button below, and we will answer them as we're able to. So I'll stop here, but thank you. And back over to you, Alli.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Braxton and Simmer, for this great presentation previewing this upcoming brief. Again, if anyone has questions about the connection between mental health and psychosocial well-being and self-reliance, or about the upcoming brief, please add them to the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to address those. And stay tuned for more information about the upcoming brief, as well as our launch event for that. With that, we will go ahead and transition over into our panel discussion today, which will focus on the relationship between disability inclusion and self-reliance with our panel of experts. So we'll go ahead and bring them in here, and then we will get going. Right. Welcome, panel. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here with us today. Our first question for the panel will be round robin style. So we'll ask each panelist to give us a brief 2-minute response before we dive deeper into today's topic. So starting with Mustafa, would each of you please tell us a bit about your work related to forced displacement, disability inclusion, and self-reliance? Over to you, Mustafa.
Yes. Well, my name is Mustafa Rafat. I am incoming assistant professor, and my work primarily focuses on social determinants of health, disability, and forced migration. And through these through these areas, I try to find community-based solutions to integrate refugees and immigrants with disabilities. And I have a community advisory board that assists me with my research and to make sure that the work that I'm doing is embedded in communities' views. Yeah, that's basically about my work.
Great. Thank you so much. Looking forward to hearing more from your research and work on these topics. Over to you, Elham.
Thank you so much, Ali. So as mentioned, I work with the International Refugee Assistance Project as the Director of Disability Inclusion and Accessibility. Basically, the core mandate that I define for myself is that refugees and forcibly displaced people with disabilities have equal right to access safety and dignity and what we call solutions for refugees, whether it is integration in the host community, whether it is resettlement and access to third country solutions, and whether it is return to safety, voluntarily, sustainable, and dignity. So basically, self-reliance is a very important part of what I'm trying to achieve. Because first of all, I'm trying to document the challenges that refugees with disabilities face in accessing these solutions. For example, I look at like what challenges refugees with disabilities face to become part of the host community. And of course, being self-reliant is an important component for that. So that's where I look into the challenges that they face because of lack of accessibility, lack of inclusion, to be part of the host community. I also look into how lack of equal access to self-reliance initiative would cause barriers to accessing third country solutions. There are lots of assumptions out there about, refugees with disabilities will not be able to be contributing members of the society if they become resettled. So expressly or impliedly, they are not welcome by many countries. Many countries have concrete policies. Some of them have not policies out there, but in practice, they try not to have refugees with disabilities being resettled. And many of that is because of the challenges to self-reliance, real challenges or perceived challenges to self-reliance. And finally, for the discussion on on the return into safety and dignity in a voluntary way, one important thing thing to measure to make sure that, you know, return is equally safe, dignified for refugees with disabilities is that are they going to be able to have a self-reliant life when they go back to their respective country? So as you see, self-reliance has an important role in all the journey of a refugee with disability, which I'm trying to document the challenges, identify solutions, and advocate. Of course, it's not the job of one person, so I try, but basically that's the connection. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your important contributions to this work and looking forward to hearing more as we continue the conversation. Now over to you, Julius.
Well, thank you, Ali. As you rightly said, my name is Julius Dobwa. I'm the Office Director of Newcomers with Disabilities in Sweden, which is a disabled refugee-led organization that is advocating for the accessible integration of refugees with disability in the Swedish society. What we do there is we try to build a community for refugees with disabilities and their family, where we organize breaking isolation activities twice every month. It's a gathering where people just come the way they are and they can get peer support from the others who have settled for a long time and give them tips, be it in job hunting or in housing or navigating the Swedish bureaucratic system. We also try to do advocacy work with the government, be it going to the parliament and presenting challenges and solutions. But that's with newcomers. I'm also the Executive Director of Global Network of Refugees with Disabilities, which is a network that brings together grassroots movement of refugees with disability organization. We come together to give them a platform where they can have a voice, be it at the national, regional, and at the also global level. What we do there essentially is to make sure that the voices of refugees with disability are not missed in important conversations, be it globally. For example, we celebrated together with AHAM organization the 75th anniversary of CRPD, that we give platform to some of these organizations to be seen, heard, and their views taken into consideration, because most of the time refugees with disabilities are invisible and lost between the big voices of OPDs, local organization of persons with disability, which sometimes are not necessarily welcoming to refugees with disability, and the main refugee-led organizations, which are not sometimes necessarily disability inclusive. So you see that refugees with disability fall between the cracks of these two walls. And so we try to bridge that gap, trying to mend fences and see that both OPDs and refugees with disability can coexist peacefully. It's a fight that we can support each other rather than tearing each other apart. And also at the global level, together with UNHCR, making migration and asylum policy more disability inclusive, and also trying to talk with some member states to see how we can influence global disability policy. With climate change is also a big part of us, so that we want to engage. Recently, I just became appointed member of the Climate Disability Caucus. I'm one of the committee members. So I'm trying to bring the voices of refugees with disability on the climate disability inclusion discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing a bit about your work from the grassroots all the way up to the policy advocacy space and everywhere in between. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your work as we continue the conversation as well. So great. For the next question, we'll dive a little bit deeper. I'd like to start with Elham this time. So in a previous RSRI 12 months, 12 domains webinar, our panel discussion explored how access to healthcare influences refugee self-reliance. Meanwhile, this health status session instead focuses on disability inclusion within self-reliance efforts. It is important to note that disability and health are related but distinct concepts. So many people with disabilities do not have ongoing health conditions, while many people with health conditions do not identify as having disabilities. So how do different disability frameworks, such as medical, social, and rights-based models, shape approaches to refugee inclusion? What are the implications of these frameworks for employers, service providers, self-reliance policymakers, and refugees themselves? Elham, over to you.
Yeah, that's a huge question, and we can have like an hour conversation about it. But basically, the whole disability movement, which ended to the adoption of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and is being reflected in many disability laws at national level, and also in the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy, is based on this paradigm shift to look disability as a human rights and social issue rather than a medical issue. And that's why we always try to kind of resist classifying and categorizing disability discussions under health, because looking at disability from medical perspective means that you are putting the burden on the person and seeing disability only as an impairment, physical impairment, like or sensory impairment, like being blind, or intellectual impairment, or mental health impairment. But disability is much more than just the impairment. Disability basically, from the social definition or right-based definition, is the outcome of the impairment plus the barriers that exist which hinder equal access and equal participation in society. Those barriers may be environmental barriers, like the famous stairs in front of a building for someone who is using a wheelchair. The barriers can be attitudinal, the stigma, the thinking that, a person with disability cannot be a good lawyer because they are disabled. Or cannot be running a family as a mother, cannot be a good mother because they have disability. They're gonna need help. How they can take care of kids when they are needing help themselves. These are stigma. These are attitudinal barriers. The barriers can be communication barriers, like, for example, for a deaf person, lack of sign language interpretation, which would create challenges for them to access and communicate on equal basis. And finally, barriers can be institutional, like structural, like laws and policies that directly or indirectly discriminate based on disability. So looking at disability from this perspective would change many things, including in the self-reliance discussions. Because if you look at disability only from medical point of view, then in the self-reliance discussions, you're going to see disability just as, someone has like a problem, like a impairment, something that we need to fix. And if we cannot fix, we need to make sure that they are having a comfortable life and they have what they need. We don't see them as contributing members of society, as a refugee who can have a job, who can run a family, who can be contributing and active members of the society. So that is the important aspect that should be, in my opinion, not only mainstream, not only discussed in this session today, but basically mainstream in all your 12 domains. So basically every single angle of the self-reliance can have and must have a disability angle, talking about, when we talk about housing, how to make sure that this housing is accessible equally for refugees with disabilities. When we talk about social protection, what are the obligations to make sure that refugees with disabilities are equally accessing social protection? So that's in a nutshell why we highly recommend not to categorize disability as a medical issue. While many people with disabilities have, of course, right access to healthcare, which my colleague Mustafa will talk about that more. But I'm here to highlight this aspect of not viewing disability from medical point of view. Over.
Great. Thank you so much. And over to you, Mustafa.
Yes, thank you. I think this is a very, very critical question. From my experience as a person with disabilities, doing work in this area, the default mode is always medical model. Throughout my journey from Iraq to refugee camp to being in the United States, the first thing people, when I disclosed that I'm a person with disabilities, or when they saw me, that the first thing were like, well, you can't do this, that you have health conditions. So the framing of the issue is always really set on like trying to locate the problem within the person rather than asking what issues can prevent this person from being successful. Because the way we frame the question will result in how we find solutions. And again, as my colleague Ilham emphasized that in medical model, we are, basically our solution is to try to diagnose, try to treat, but we know there are, health issues that can't be treated, that there are issues, yes, with medications, you are reducing some symptoms. And this is where we are coming to the social model and really trying to see what issues can we improve, like in our environment. And in the social model, I really compare it to the main social work theory, person and environment. We are trying to see what problems are preventing an individual from fully enjoying their life. I can give you a couple of examples from my experience and from my research. I remember my first, cultural orientation before coming to United States. That officer explained the types of jobs available in the United States. And after the orientation, when I approached him and I was like, well, I have disabilities, so you did not discuss anything that, will be applicable in my condition. And he looked at me and he basically told me, well, don't think about, don't worry about jobs. You'll be just you'll be accessing welfare when you get to United States. And that was not the solution. That was not the answer I was looking for. As a young man, 20 years old, I was trying to find like what can work for me. And that's the medical model in practice. And I think an important issue also missing here is the right-based model. And this is a very important issue in the United States that we need to and we must recognize individuals with disabilities as individuals with rights, that organizations, service providers have obligations to follow disability laws in the United States, for example. In other countries, which almost all countries accepted a CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I think the important question here to ask is, what type of disability laws are we violating in this work? And that will help us rethink how we approach persons with disabilities. And this has a very important implication because we are moving away from asking, can this person do the job, to what reasonable accommodations will allow this person to succeed? And trust me, these two questions will determine the fate of that person, because in my research, my recent research I did a qualitative study with 41 refugees with disabilities, and across the board, they were constantly bombarded by inaccessibilities that each of the participants that I interviewed, each refugee, all of them were refugees with disabilities. They were just basically viewed through the medical model that despite having goals, aspirations, trying their best to be a successful member of society, that they came across barriers that prevented them from being self-reliant, except three participants, in which three of them accidentally got introduced to disability programs in their communities. And their stories, their experiences completely changed with simple accommodations, with simple resources. For example, a refugee, she was with a blind refugee. She, from the start, she got the training that she needs, such as mobility, how to use brailles, how to access transportation, and she got a counselor who guided her to access her college degree. And the result was significantly different. One of my questions was about the success, and she was holding a job. She was very happy. Um, she was telling me it wasn't just only about self-reliance, but how disability policies protected her. And she was like, because of this training, disability training that I went through, now I know what my rights are. If someone discriminates against me, I know how to file complaints. And to me, that was very empowering that she knows her rights, and because of the training, she got a job, and she was like, I don't need food assistance. I don't need SSI, supplemental security income. And yeah, so I think that I can sit and talk all day, I feel like here, but you can see the difference between the medical model and the social model and its implications on the ground.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. I think it's, so clear from both of your answers, the need to shift away from this individualized, stigmatizing approach to one that really, looks at the full system and how the system can be more inclusive and dignified in its approach to supporting refugees with disabilities. So thank you for both for illustrating those with clear examples. I'll shift over to my next question now, and I'll start with Julius this time. What opportunities exist to strengthen collaboration between refugee serving organizations, disability rights organizations, governments, employers, and host communities? How can partnerships between these different entities better support people at the intersection of forced displacement and disability?
Thank you, Ali, for this very important question. People at the intersection of forced displacement and disability often face multiple overlapping barriers, making collaboration across sectors very, very essential. Refugee-led organizations bring on the table expertise on protection, asylum system, and displacement context, while disability rights organizations or OPDs contribute knowledge on accessibility, reasonable accommodation, and right of persons with disability. Governments too play a critical role in creating inclusive and the right of persons with disability being respected through the CRPD Convention. Government can also play a role in bringing in inclusive policies and ensuring access to public services, while employers can also expand economic opportunities through inclusive hiring, workplace accommodation, providing reasonable accommodation to hire refugees with a disability. We should also take into account the host communities, which are equally important in fostering social cohesion, reducing stigma, and creating welcoming environment. One key opportunity is to establish a formal partnership and coordination mechanism that includes refugees with disability and their respective organization as equal partners on the table when it comes to inclusive policies, rather than simply beneficiary, as Mustafa and Aram clearly said in the previous question you asked them. Most of the time, they see refugees with disability as beneficiaries, not as people who can really contribute to the growth of the economy and the community where they live. So joint programming between refugee-led organizations, OPDs, humanitarian actors, local authorities can help ensure that services such as healthcare, housing, or livelihood, or even legal assistance are disability inclusive, and which can also not only help the refugees with disability community, but can also help the community members. For example, if they put a lift somewhere in the subway that is for persons with disability, I think babies to mothers to who have babies will also use the lift. So making an environment disability inclusive is also good for the community, not only for persons with disability or refugees themselves. As we are looking at opportunities, employers can also partner also with refugees with disability or displaced persons with disability and their organizations to create pathway to decent work, like skills, mentorship, internship, or even hiring people based on their capacity. When you make your workspace more reasonable, accommodative, then the disability lens just disappear. Another important opportunity I want to say, it lies on data collection and evidence generation as well. Collaborative research and monitoring can help address current lack of data when it comes to refugees with disability and inform more effective policies and programming. We know nowadays that when there is no data on any minority community, then they are invisible. So those are some of the opportunities. And if we are really serious about disability inclusion, then the principle of nothing about us without us should also apply when it comes to refugees with disabilities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Julius, especially for highlighting the role of participation and equal partnership and coordination with refugees with disabilities, not as beneficiaries, but as true, meaningful partners. I also, before I move over to Elham to hear your thoughts on this question, want to thank you also, both of you, for mentioning the role of disability inclusion, not just in the health status domain, but across all domains of self-reliance, accessibility in housing and education and employment. Important to bring all of those into the conversation here. So thank you for doing that. And Elham, over to you. What do you feel in terms of opportunities for collaboration between different entities?
Well, actually, I kind of can easily bridge this to the previous question because, we talked about the right-based approach to disability and, distancing ourselves from the medical approach, which I know is not easy. For many years, people have seen disability, basically, let's face it, in many people's views, disability is just like a health condition that cannot be treated, or is like more of a permanent nature that needs constant treatment. So from that perspective, like moving towards seeing disability as a human rights issue and seeing people with disability as a part of human diversity, that needs to be respected. And if they have the equal the accommodation they need, if the society is accessible, if the barriers are removed, they can equally participate in the society, have equal rights, equal responsibilities, and equal contributions. Changing to this attitude is not easy, and applying this lens through everything that is done, from the planning towards the implementation, towards monitoring, is not easy. That's where partnership with organizations of persons with disabilities and disability rights organization is helpful. So, refugee serving organizations, leading self-reliance can benefit from this partnership with organizations of people with disabilities that are, adopting the right-based approach to help them to institutionalize this approach in their planning, implementation, and monitoring, from the project design, budgeting, strategizing. I also want to open an important parenthesis in here and say not necessarily every organization of persons with disabilities does have that right-based approach. So do not make the assumption that, okay, I talked to this person with disability, to Elham, she told me this is the right approach. So when she says so, she's right. No, not necessarily every person with disability or every organization of people with disabilities look at disability from that lens. So identifying right-based approach organizations of people with disabilities and partnering with them would help the refugee serving organizations to move towards institutionalizing that approach in their work from the scratch in the whole cycle. And on the other side, partnering with refugee serving organizations will help organizations of persons with disabilities to open up their activities, their membership, their mission, vision, their advocacy work to those people with disabilities who are not nationals, who are refugees, who are forcibly displaced migrants under any legal status. I tend to adopt that wider lens. I know that from the refugee self-reliance UNHCR perspective, is only limited to people who have the refugee status determination, but from my perspective, it can include anybody who is forced to flee and is in a second country. So that partnership would help them as well to expand their mandate and assist and cover more people with disabilities, not just national. So that's a mutually beneficial partnership. And at the same time, we are living in a era of shrinking funds, shrinking opportunities, very limited opportunities, and more and more we are seeing like governments and other public officials adopting anti-immigrant, anti-refugee attitudes. So partnership, working in groups, collaboration is a very important way and very efficient tool to use to make best of what we have, like the limited resources, the limited opportunities we have, in the best way. I also want to you talked about how we all are talking about mainstreaming disability in all domains. I also want to mention that basically we recommend the twin track approach, which is specific measures that are needed to ensure self-reliance for refugees with disabilities, right? Everything that you do, you still might need to do a few more steps, take a few more steps to make sure that refugees with disabilities can equally become self-reliant and benefit from self-reliance activities. For example, access to assistive technology, right? Without providing assistive technology, which may include wheelchairs, hearing aid, glasses, crutches, computers, like which are equipped with screen reader software or other assistive technology that help people with disabilities to equally participate. Without that, self-reliance is not going to be possible. So it's important to define a specific place for access to assistive technology in the self-reliance, index. On the top of that, so this is the specific measures targeting people with disabilities. And then on the top of that, of course, the mainstreaming. So every single index can have and should have some indicators on how to make sure that, refugees with disabilities can equally benefit. For example, on education, we advocate for inclusive education, which means that all education systems should be able to benefit all learners, and all learners, regardless of the different methods and ways of learning, should be able to learn next to each other. This is inclusive education, which is under the Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And, at the UN, for example, UNICEF disability team is advocating for. Or, for example, on livelihood, how to make sure that livelihood opportunities, we have opportunities that are accessible and suitable for different groups of people with different impairments, so on and so forth. So that's what we call twin track approach, which means that specific targeted measures for people with disabilities is important, is necessary, but not enough. And mainstreaming disability is important, necessary, but not enough. We need both of them next to each other and on the top of each other to make sure that our self-reliance initiative is equally inclusive and accessible for refugees with disabilities.
Great. Thank you so much for adding all of that. And Mustafa, would you like to come in on the power of collaboration?
Absolutely. I think first we need to define what collaboration means. I put in the comment about the Himmelman's model of collaboration, which I think is very important for almost every sector, every providers to understand. In this model, the author divides it into 4 steps, which starts with networking. This is just basically exchanging of information. Then you move to coordination, in which you are taking further steps to exchange information and adjust some activities, to cooperation, which is like sharing resources, sharing informations, and other responsibilities. Then you actually move to collaboration. This is where you are enhancing each other's capacity to ensure that the served population is getting what they need. I want to give you an example here. When I started my college, I have physical disabilities, and I was carrying my books and notes on my back. And the West Virginia University is very steep like. So I got very ill. I was hospitalized, and I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna quit. And here, because I was in social work, my supervisor was aware of disability resources in the community. And when she referred me to a disability organization, they made simple adjustments. Instead of carrying 5, 6 heavy books and notebooks, they gave me a backpack that has wheels, and then they borrowed me an iPad in which they put all my books, and I can take my notes on the iPad. And I came back to campus just, dragging with me a backpack that has wheel, that is very easy to carry. I have an iPad that I can type, and that just changed my whole college experience, from a point where I decided to quit college because of inaccessibility, and to a point where I thrived. So this is the power of collaboration. But I want to emphasize here is that from my research interviewing 26 service providers, especially focusing on this point, I love how one person framed it is that he said disability programs, disability resources are often hidden treasure. That means, outside disability worlds, when it comes to other organizations here, for example, Refugee and Immigration Organization, don't know anything about what disability programs exists, what type of services they provide. And here you have refugees and immigrants just falling through the crack, and living in the United States for 10, 20, or forever, and not knowing what basic resources are available in their community.
Thank you so much for sharing that example from your own life, as well as this model of collaboration that many organizations could adopt to improve their own collaboration with refugees with disabilities, to truly improve services and programming. I have a few more questions, but I see we have a question from an audience member that I wanted to bring in. So this is open to anyone who would like to use it. And a reminder to our audience to please add more questions to the Q&A as you wish. But I'll bring this in ahead of our formal Q&A session. How do you tackle the deficit mindset? And in terms of barriers to employment, where businesses do not want to invest in these supports when intellectual disabilities are involved. So what would you say to employers to get them to invest in resources for refugees with disabilities who have skills and capacities that they can bring? And how do you tackle that deficit mindset at that institutional level?
Well, I can go.
Okay.
The first thing here is about awareness. We need to create awareness that these refugees with disability, they may come with some deficit in terms of IT or maybe education. Then capacity building is the key because nobody was born with any knowledge. And once the right, accessible, accommodative environment is provided, then there is no limit to any human being in which, when it comes to skills, capacity to acquire skills, if the right services and the right accessible or reasonable accommodation is provided. Like we have Dr. Mustafa here just share his experience of coming to US and people saying he cannot make it. But when he was given the opportunity to see where he is today. So it's the same with those employers who are looking at refugees with disability are saying, oh, maybe he has no qualification, he has no skills. Here we need high standard and high education. They should come down and just invest bit of resources from the huge profit they are making. They can invest some of them to train people to provide accessible working environment to people with disability, and they'll be rightful contributors and taxpayers in their community.
Great, thank you so much. And as Mustafa mentioned, even something like a backpack with wheels can make a huge difference and allow those capacities and skills to be brought forward. Elham, over to you.
Yeah, just on the top of what Julius rightly mentioned. First of all, I think it's important to document success stories and change the narrative. How much we have these success stories of like a person with intellectual disability being like a great cook, being a great artist, being a great, I don't know, shopkeeper, whatever job that they like you to have, or like any other things. So how much first of all, the first step is to document those success stories and distribute them, disseminate them, so that that's how basically Julius mentioned we raise the awareness and change the narrative. And of course, also investing on people with disabilities themselves to acquire skills that would put them as job markets. And here again, I come back to the Self-Reliance Initiative, like identifying, and planning the livelihood programs based on the available opportunities for a person with disability in the job market. Like for example, you're operating in a country like Kenya, you look into, what kind of job opportunities a blind woman can have in Kenya. And then based on that, plan your livelihood programs rather than planning in abstract or something that works for other women, not necessarily for a blind woman, and say, oh, we are just teaching you how to use a sewing machine. And since you're blind, maybe you cannot use the sewing machine. So you cannot benefit from this program. So you go and get some like packages of food or clothing, and that's how you become self-reliant because we assist you, So basically considering these needs when we are providing job skills to refugees with disabilities in our self-reliance initiatives is another angle. And eventually, I want to say something. We have the law, right? Eventually, if any stakeholder doesn't comply with their legal obligations, in many countries, we have anti-disability discrimination laws. So eventually using those laws to enforce, take them to the court, enforce them, and do advocacy. If it's not working, then taking them to the court and doing litigation. And then when other employers know such laws exist and such court judgments exist, probably they're gonna rethink about it if they want to just reject someone just based on disability. And again, here, also collaboration with organizations of persons with disabilities can help a lot, because they do that. They go through that journey for people with disabilities in general, so they can be very helpful in sharing like methods and tools and solutions to how to tackle that stigma and the resistance to employ refugees with disabilities. Thank you.
Yes,
Go ahead,
such a-
Mustafa.
Yes, great points from my colleagues. I just want to add here is that we are talking about the largest minority group in the world. For example, in the United States, 1 in every 4 Americans are with disabilities. And among refugee populations, based on my scoping review studies and other UN reports, more than 1/3 of refugees have at least one type of disabilities. So this is a big population here we are talking about. This is not like 1-2%. So that means this is really untapped resources. I love how Microsoft have initiated multiple programs to include people with disabilities, because we are consumers, we are producers. So and really it benefits everyone. And I think like here in the United States, especially, like there are multiple policies for employer when they hire a person with disabilities. For example, getting a tax exempt, or there is so many benefits for hiring, and then you are getting the experience as well. Like for example, in my study, one deaf refugee who was about 6-7 months just trapped in a cycle of not finding a job, not being able to get the help that he needs from a refugee program. And he decided, I think like he found a bicycle or someone gave him a bicycle, and he started touring the neighborhood, knocking on every store to find a job. And he came across a welding store, and he was a welder for more than 20 years. So he is bringing an important experience to this. Although he's a deaf refugee, so I did the interview before he found that job. So he was in that cycle of, not getting help from refugee organization. And then I did follow up with him, and the way he was describing his experience was mind-blowing for me. He toured that neighborhood. He located that welding store, and then that guy trusted him. That guy believed in him, that manager. And then he gave him the job. And it was about 3-4 months when I did the follow-up interview with him. And he was like, I'm gonna call my manager, and I went to speak with him. And when I spoke with the manager, the first thing he told me is that how easy it is to communicate with this deaf refugee. And to me, that was mind-blowing. That manager couldn't use any sign language. And this person couldn't speak any English, but through technology, they were able to communicate. And he was one of the best employer in his store. And he was like, we want to keep this person. We will we'll do everything to like keep him working. And just this tells you like these simple changes that opens up doors to you, to a population that is filled with important experience that is missing from current practices.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing in that story and really great example of making it accessible for then someone to bring their skills and talents to the forefront, benefiting both the employer and their own lives and self-reliance. So really appreciate that. Um, I see there are some more questions in the Q&A box that have come in. So far, we don't have any for our previous speakers on mental health and psychosocial well-being, but if audience members have questions for our speakers, please do include those as well. I see we have one attendee who said that they work as an advocate in Arabic and international sign language interpreter, and the most challenging thing that they have seen with refugees with disabilities is that they do not have the right services when they came or arrived here to this person's context in the US. And this person suggests the need for a disability liaison who can connect refugees with their right agencies from day one or even before they arrive. So thank you to this person for sharing that. And then I want to have raise a question from Jessica in the chat, which kind of goes along with the conversation we were having around different disability frameworks. Jessica says most disability resources are provided based on a diagnosis, which reinforces the medical model. Are there any existing examples, frameworks, or models that show how our orgs and public disability offices can move away from the medical model and deficit focus in order to provide those disability resources? Would anyone like to respond to this question?
I can try. Well, look, we are not against being visited by a medical professional. What we are saying is that more than like medical condition is about the function. For example, I'm a blind person and I'm using screen reader software to, for example, participate in this webinar today, to find the unmute button on my screen based on what I hear my screen reader reads to me. But not all blind people do that. For some, they have not have the acquired the skill. Some of them, may have like some vision and they prefer to use like a magnifier. So if you just rely on medical diagnosis, you're gonna end up to a one size fits all. So that's why we are saying that, of course, to confirm the impairment, you may need to go through like medical assessment. But what we are advocating for is that, the accessibility accommodation provided should be based on each person's needs and functionality. So to measure disability, there is this important list of questions called Washington Group list of questions, which we call them Washington Group because they are a group of experts who first shaped in Washington. And those questions to measure disability, instead of asking, do you have a disability? They ask, do you have any problem seeing? Do you have any problem hearing? Do you have any problem walking or climbing the stairs? And based on the answer, if the answer is yes, I cannot see at all, or I cannot climb the stairs at all, I have a lot of challenges climbing the stairs or walking, you would be categorized as a person with disability. And if you say, no, I don't have any problem seeing, or I have a little bit of problem seeing, then you're not going to be categorized as a person with disability. So rather than, they are basically making the identification of disability based on each person's function. And integrating that attitude, that approach of like Washington Group questions and measuring disability based on function would be very helpful, because many people may not be diagnosed with a certain condition, not necessarily being the right way to assess the disability, but rather than focusing on the function and the challenges that each person has in certain function, you would be able to provide a better assistance, more tailored to each person's needs and specific circumstances. Yeah, so that's what I say, like make it more like a case by case and tailoring to each person's needs and functionalities. I don't know if others want to add anything.
Yes, I think like especially when it comes to refugee context, unfortunately, lack of disability data and information is a huge problem. That basically literally stops service providers from doing anything when it comes to refugees. Across the board, service providers, when I interviewed them, for example, one service provider even she printed out and she was like, "Look, Mustafa, there's this refugee coming to United States next week, and the only information I'm getting on the background, on the bio, it says medical. So what medical means? Like, do I need to prepare hearing aid? Do I need to prepare wheelchair for this person? What is the need?" And because of this lack of data, I mean, what I notice is even like that gap kind of like leads to other gaps. So when that person arrives here, they're going to get resources late. They will be neglected because there wasn't any preparation from the beginning. And that's what we saw, like especially when in the United States, when the new administration took office and they cut refugee resources, those with disabilities were the most hit because there wasn't any preparation, there wasn't any data, there wasn't any like how can we best serve this population? And to my colleagues, Elham added the Washington group. Here in the US, we use American Community Survey. It's very similar to Washington Group. You're basically having these basic questions that is helping you identify what are the needs and what can we do about it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I see we only have a few minutes left. So before I close this out, I just want to open the floor if there's anything else each of you wants to share in 1 or 2 minutes around research, policy, programming, any final reflections or thoughts that you want us as a key takeaway to leave this call with. We'll start with Julius if you have any.
Yes, one important thing is about the mental health issues, problems that is plaguing refugees with disability community, that people are not paying attention to it. You see all this struggle, frustration due to housing, inaccessibility, all that when people come back, they are down. You see people come maybe in US, in Sweden to get a job, they don't have a job. And if you don't have a job, you don't go out socializing, you tend to be very isolated. And that causes depression, and depression leads to mental health issues. So the work of Dr. Braxton and Singh is very important if we can integrate mental health and healing, community healing into the integration and holistic approach in dealing with how do we inclusion of refugees with disability. We cannot be talking about inclusion and neglecting their mental health, given the stress, given even the stigma that they face back home in their various community, because we should face it. Back home, in most community, people with disability are seen as backlogs, witches, and people you don't want to associate yourself with. And this turn leads people to be isolated or give some wounds that you carry along with that never really heals. And then you come again to a newfound land that you thought is a dreamland. You are faced with all this inaccessibility and the bureaucratic hurdle. So this really affects your mental ability. And that's why the health of most refugees with disability tend to even decline when they are in the host community. So I just want to point that out and say that the mental health should be also one of the things that we should really factor when it comes to disability inclusion.
Thank you. And over to you, Mustafa.
Yes, I think my take-home message is really we need to like think about like refugees with disabilities are not, you know, inherently vulnerable or dependent. It is the environment that is creating vulnerability, the inaccessibility that is creating dependency. And really, really important here is that disability inclusion should not be an afterthought issue. That is a huge, huge problem that made me suffer for many years trying to find resources. And in my study, those 38 participants had no idea about what what disability resources available for them. So disability should not be an afterthought. It should be the forefront of every work we do.
Thank you. And last but not least, Elham.
Sure. I have two things. First of all, do not think that disability is a specialized issue. You don't know how to, include people with disabilities, so you should find a specialized person. And since you don't know how to do it, you don't do it. Or do not make the assumption that, well, I'm not excluding anyone, so everyone can benefit from it. No, that's not true. Inclusion needs concrete, targeted thought measures. So if you are not taking specific targeted measures designed to include people with disabilities, I'm so sorry to say that you're basically excluding them. And that disability inclusion is and can happen and should happen everywhere, whether you are designing a project, putting aside, like framing a budget, whether you are like writing a report, a paper, you are doing a research, doing a monitoring exercise, whether you are implementing a project, whether you are procuring or purchasing some equipment or services, anything that you do, there can be and should be a disability angle. So ask for it, think about it, and be mindful. And I would, if I could, I would put a sticker on everyone's monitor saying, what about people with disabilities? So you see it every single day. Whatever you do, whatever document you open to work on, ask yourself, what about people with disabilities? What should I do to include people with disabilities? That's it.
Great. Thank you so much for including that. I'm just adding in all of our speakers so I can thank you. Thank you to Dr. Sanasha Braxton and Simar Singh for your presentation on the relationship between mental health and psychosocial well-being and self-reliance, and to our expert panel for this really rich and important discussion on disability inclusion. Before formally closing our session, please check the chat. We have a link to a quick 30-second survey about your experience engaging with this session. Your feedback will really help us to improve future webinars as part of this 12 months, 12 domains learning series. Some key takeaways from this event, as you've heard from our speakers: actors across all self-reliance sectors and programs have a role to play. Just as self-reliance isn't purely about an individual and their economic capacity, disability inclusion isn't about an individual and their medical diagnosis. No refugee or person with disability is a monolith, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We really need a holistic person, strengths-based models that put the pressure on systems to change for stronger inclusion. There's key opportunities for formal partnerships and collaborations. And essential to this is uplifting refugees with disabilities as equal partners across all parts of the program and policy process. The lack of data is a huge issue, so there's a need for stronger research and monitoring, as well as documenting success stories, raising awareness, and changing narratives. And it's important to map local opportunities for persons with disabilities and plan livelihood programming around that. These are just some of my key takeaways. I hope you learned something from this session. Thank you to all for attending this. We will share out the recording and more education via our Community of Practice newsletter, so please be sure to sign up via our website if you have not already. And finally, I want to mention that we will have a blog post coming out at the end of this month from our partners Youth Voices Community, an RLO in urban Nairobi, who will share follow-up from their project with the RSRI back in 2024 on disability inclusion in urban Nairobi. So be on the lookout for that blog post. Thank you all for joining. Thanks again to our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you all for next month's webinar, which will be focused on access to employment and refugee self-reliance. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.